Hello again, everyone. So for this lecture, I'm going to talk about post-war prosperity in American culture and also compare it to what's happening in terms of consumer culture in the Soviet Union at this same time. And a lot of this aligns with what's discussed in Eric Foner's chapter on the affluent society. So we'll start off with a little bit of context about that. So keep in mind, during the 15 years after World War II, it's one of the most prosperous times in American history. More Americans are kind of classified as middle class. Wealth is more evenly distributed than any time before or after this period. You have a growth of wages, low unemployment, and the US is kind of a center of global manufacturing. And so all of these things contribute to the kind of wealth of Americans in this period. So some of the other factors that contribute to this are a lot of people have good kind of union jobs in defense industries and other kind of manufacturing. People generally have pension plans and health insurance, and there are trade unions. Now, it is important to keep in mind that a number of Americans are not able to have these kinds of good jobs, particularly non-white Americans. But um, overall, we do see the kind of proportion of Americans who can participate in kind of the benefits of middle class life is broader than any other historical era. And these images are kind of the symbols of that prosperity, right? And you see kind of echoes of what we talked about in the consumer culture of the 1920s, these new products that are celebrated in advertising. But this era, it's even more so because there are just more Americans who really do have the ability to purchase these kinds of things, and particularly new things like televisions, which becomes a new kind of symbol, a new medium for both promoting consumer culture and also kind of as a product itself. So now I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the Soviet Union with an understanding of who Nikita Khrushchev was. Now, he is kind of rising into power in the Soviet system in the early 1950s. And when he becomes the Soviet premier, he really is a is a great alternative to Joseph Stalin. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was incredibly repressive. It was a time when people were killed. Millions of people were killed, forced into forced labor camps. They were tortured, um, displaced. The terrors of the Stalin era are quite were actually becoming more and more widely known, not only outside of the Soviet Union, but of course, even within the system. And the leadership was kind of recognizing that some were reacting against it and genuinely wanted reform, and some were realizing that you simply couldn't just rule people with this kind of absolute system of terror, that you needed to adopt more reforms. And Khrushchev emerges as one of those key reformers. He gives what's called a kind of secret speech about this kind of idea of the cult of personality. What it really is a critique of Stalin, how Stalin purged other rivals from leadership positions in order to consolidate his own power. And Khrushchev wants to move away from that dramatically. So he renounces Stalin's kind of reign of terror. He allows more public discourse, and he does want to improve the material conditions of ordinary people. But of course, he wants to do this all without creating a new political system. He doesn't want to relinquish the power of his own position or of the general kind of party position, but he does want to make life better for more citizens of the Soviet Union. So it's during this time that he has this interesting set of exchanges with then Vice President Richard Nixon in 1959. And it kind of represents this general thaw in relations. So another one of the things that happens under Khrushchev is that there's the tensions between the US and the USSR are somewhat diminished, and there are these kinds of friendly exchanges. There are more kind of open dialogue between the two superpowers. And so that's what the kitchen debate really is. It's not a formal debate, but really a series of kind of informal conversations. Some of them are more kind of pointed or heated, but many of them are also kind of friendly, kind of friendly banter between the leaders, or some of the main leaders of these two superpowers. So the kitchen debate happens at the American National Exhibit, which was in Moscow in July of 1959. And Nixon is sort of leading Khrushchev on this tour. And the focus of this exhibit is American consumer goods, mainly household appliances. So rather than talking about technologies of space exploration or other kinds of defense technologies, this is really focused on domestic consumer goods. But in the process, there's also this kind of banter about the strengths of each country and their economic policies. So here's one of the images of the exhibit. You see Soviet citizens kind of walking past these displays of new appliances. You can see that the emphasis really is on things of the household. So, and this is one dialogue in the debate. Richard Nixon takes Khrushchev to an American kitchen, and he says, it's like those in our houses in California. And keep in mind, California as a state is also, even within the United States, kind of the ultimate symbol of this prosperity. It's where lots of people are moving to for these better jobs. So that's not accidental that he's kind of talking about this as being in California. And so here Nixon, he points to the dishwasher. Khrushchev somewhat dismissively says, well, we have such things. But Nixon says, well, this is our newest model. And in America, we like to make life easier for women. This was such an emphasis on the exhibit, was how American culture was beneficial to women in particular. It kind of, it confirmed, sort of reinforced their role in the domestic sphere, but it said we can make that domestic work so much easier, and we can allow women to have more leisure time than they would have otherwise. And Khrushchev sort of says, again, dismissively, that your capitalistic attitude toward women does not occur under communism. And this is a very interesting comment, given that there actually is some of that same emphasis on domesticity and the women's role as the kind of heads of household in the Soviet system. But he's right that it's certainly not as intense as it is in the United States. And there has long been, within the Soviet Union, more advocacy for women's rights, for women as workers, for women's ability to be a part of public life and be producers, not just consumers. So really, there is a somewhat different understanding of women's role in the Soviet system, and there is a kind of more egalitarian way of viewing women's roles than we have in the United States at the time. This is another image from the exhibition. And so you see that not only were they kind of displays of the appliances, but also of American women actually making these things in the kitchen, right? Of baking and cooking to kind of show how easy some of these new inventions are to use. So the Soviet press, when they watch this exhibit, some of them, and keep in mind a lot of this is out of defending their own kind of system, and this is the Soviet press is also highly censored by the Soviet government. But they do sort of lament, this emphasis on consumer goods, and they say, why are we talking about science, technology, and why is this so focused on women? The reason that the Soviet press wanted to issue this critique is because in those areas at that point, the Soviet Union actually is making greater progress, particularly in space exploration, right? So when we go to those things, which the Soviet Union is actually devoting more of their resources to, then you could have much more of a justifiable claim to kind of say the benefits of the Soviet system. But when you talk about consumer goods and household, that is where the Soviets are at a distinct disadvantage. And so, of course, that's why the American exhibit puts such an emphasis on that. And there is this underlying idea that, well, if we can kind of convince all of these Soviet women in particular, have them see the abundance of consumer goods that are available, then will help kind of propel more reform within the Soviet system and more of a kind of critique of the Soviet system from within. Here's another example of an exchange with regard to housing in particular. And I wanted to highlight this because I also think there are some interesting kind of highlights and contradictions. So Nixon talks about, this house, that it's affordable for anyone, especially kind of World War II veterans. And he says our steel workers can buy this, but he also has to acknowledge the steel workers are currently on strike, which might indicate that not everything is going perfectly well in the American system. But he says they earn the kind of wages that these kinds of houses are affordable for them. And Khrushchev says, well, we also have steel workers and peasants who can afford this, but your houses are built only to last a short amount of time, whereas our houses are kind of built to last longer. We are not thinking just about today, we're thinking about generations to come. So kind of building things to last. And think of this as a very different idea than what we talked about, planned obsolescence, right? This idea that consumer goods designed only to last a kind of limited amount of time in order to encourage people to consume more. Well, Khrushchev is kind of challenging that in itself, right? And Nixon, in some ways, on the one hand, he says, well, this will actually last more than 20 years, which is pretty much true. But he says, yes, after this period of time, Americans are going to want something new, right? Their kitchen is obsolete. They might not want to change houses, but maybe they're going to want to remodel their house. So the American system is kind of reinforcing this idea of planned obsolescence, or of, after a time you're going to want something new, something different. And so you're going to want to consume something else in order to kind of keep up with the latest trends. And Khrushchev is really opposing this, right? He's sort of saying, well, no, some things they don't go out of date. Houses, furniture, these things should be built to last, and they should be built primarily for their functions rather than a particular kind of style. And here we're kind of getting into these distinct perspectives on what consumption means and what kind of consumption is good and what is kind of less desirable. So at the time, you know, there is a consumer society in the Soviet Union, but it's not out of a kind of culture of abundance. It's a culture of shortages, right? This is a system where there is often not enough. So there are limited amounts of all sorts of goods. There's rationing in place. And so families in the Soviet Union are used to these strategies of, of hoarding, of making do, of kind of trying to survive with these sometimes severe limitations. And this is what is actually causing a lot of a number of uprisings. Particularly, there was a big uprising in East Germany that came out of food shortages. So Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders are quite aware that this is a problem, that the Soviet system cannot continue with such a culture of scarcity. So they do start to investigate like what potential consumers would want. So they have what they call this Institute of Public Opinion. So they're talking to youth because they're particularly concerned that youth are kind of seeing the abundance of American youth and they're going to envy that, right? So they want to kind of see, well, is this happening, and what do Soviet youth want? They start market research at department stores, and they do have their own system of advertising, but rather than the kind of American form of advertising that's about creating this insatiable demand for more and more and more, what they emphasize is what they're calling rational consumption. And it's a way of creating more material goods for people, so that it's not a kind of culture of scarcity, but also not letting kind of popular desires get out of hand. So say a little bit more about this idea of rational consumption. There was an attempt to introduce a minimum wage, which was supposed to be enough to have a kind of modest standard of living. And that would mean you could have some of these new appliances. You could have a refrigerator, a television, a car, but that's about it, right? Not any of these other kind of fancy electrical appliances, no carpets. That was seen as kind of a luxurious kind of item. So some appliances, but in limited amounts and limited types. And they talked about this for clothing. So you should have enough clothing to wear, but you don't want to have too much clothing. You want to just aimlessly accumulate clothing. You want to have kind of a reasonable amount of clothing. And so it's part of this idea of a kind of communist morality that emphasized self-discipline, and that you're willing to kind of subsume your own desires for the collective good. Now, the people that were seen as most vulnerable to those irrational desires, those desires for more and more, were women and young people. So a lot of these efforts to make sort of rational consumers were directed at women and at young people. But there were, even within that, these efforts, particularly in the late 1950s and early 1960s, these efforts to give a few more choices to women. So this was part of kind of, saying you as a woman could have more goods than you had before, more than your mothers or grandmothers, but you can still kind of be a loyal sort of Soviet citizen. So the Soviet press starts talking about fashionable dresses and cosmetics and jewelry, and an array of shoes. So this image comes from an advertisement of, showing the new choices you would have as a consumer. And this would not be as a replacement for your role as worker and producer, though. So you could still maintain your kind of role in public life, but also be quote unquote kind of feminine and have the kinds of access to some consumer goods that women in other countries, particularly the United States, might have. This example of perfume is also really interesting because perfume in particular was seen before this as very bourgeois, as I mean, it's who needs perfume? It's not a necessity. It's something that's completely superfluous. And previously there were lots of kind of ridicules of anybody who would desire to have perfume imported from, a place like France. But now they start a kind of domestic production of Soviet perfumes. But they're saying, okay, now it's okay to have perfume. But perfume is still just, it should be a gift, and it should be given to women on International Women's Day. And it should be a gift to express on behalf of the state the gratitude and respect due to women for their continued contributions as both workers and mothers. So you can see here that they're incorporating that it's acceptable to have perfume now, but they're also imposing a very different framework for how that perfume should be offered, right? And the context for that, and putting that in the context of being a kind of loyal citizen of the Soviet state. So that's obviously a very different conception than the way perfume would be advertised at the same time in the United States. Another thing that happened in this era was that Khrushchev really focused more on services. So access to education, child care, access to housing and healthcare, and the right to work, because he saw that as a big strength of the Soviet Union, that, well, there might not be a superabundance of things, but everybody had access to those basic needs and those basic services. So that is why he often shifted the conversation to those matters. And he also talked about these kind of aspects of communal living, so communal dining spaces or communal spaces in general over this kind of individual family housing. Now, they did actually create more housing units for individual families, but a lot of the aim was to get more Soviet citizens comfortable with more communal arrangements, because one, it would make things more affordable, but they also said that this would ease women in particular of kind of the burdens of domestic life. So you have this image over here, it's this kind of cartoon of a woman who's in her kitchen, and she's trying to make the dinner, but it's a disaster, things are burning on the stove. So she gives up and she decides to go to the canteen, which was the communal dining area, and that's where people would kind of take turns or have different roles in contributing to that. But you could sit and share a meal with your family and have somebody else for that time do the cooking, help take care of the kids, right? And so it's I mean, it looks maybe to us kind of like going to a restaurant, but this is more of an arrangement where there's a kind of shared, sort of balanced workload, so that would allow women to spend time just enjoying the meal with their families rather than going through all the labor, each woman going through all the labor of cooking the meal themselves. They also had their own idea of the ideal kitchen, a more kind of austere kitchen, and this emphasis on simplicity and functionality. Don't need a lot of, excess furniture or ornaments, don't have the chandelier, it's pretentious, it's a lot of extra dust, have furniture that's multifunctional and simple kind of lights, very few sort of adornments. This idea of things that are just kind of simple and accessible. This other cartoon is another, it represents this also, this shift from, the top image seen as tacky and excessive and overly ornamented, right? Whereas the bottom one is seen as a more desirable, austere kind of space. I find this image particularly interesting today as we are kind of in a moment in American culture where there was also this kind of emphasis on more simplified living spaces, that all of the kind of adornment of that top image is something that is not really quite fashionable for Americans at the moment, and this more simplified design is actually much more consistent with what's fashionable in America today, and just kind of shows that this image doesn't necessarily imply that things are that this kind of more austere vision is necessarily more accessible, but um, this is definitely how it's promoted at the time. And finally, I want to note that, in spite of Khrushchev and then the next premier Brezhnev's efforts to do this, it's never quite enough. The Soviet system can never quite adequately provide the resources for their citizens, and so shortages continue. These crises of kind of scarcity continue in the Soviet Union, unfortunately, for long after. But this is an interesting moment when you can kind of see this this shifting kind of consumer culture, even in the context of the Soviet Union.